Hello everyone, Argent Templar here. So as with a lot of my videos, this is going to be just kind of a taste of a massive topic. Libraries have been written about our Blessed Mother, and I'm sure libraries more will be written. I'm just going to probably do a 15 to 20 minute video to just give you a bit of an introduction to Our Lady. Now, if anyone listens to this channel a fair amount, particularly my videos on religion, I do have a special devotion to Our Lady. When I took my confirmation name, it was Thomas Maria, or Thomas Rosario, one of the two. And Our Lady was kind of what led me to Catholicism. I actually kind of made a deal with her that if she could help me get through a very hard part of my life, kind of help me lose some weight, get healthier, get through a very difficult time, help me get kind of the help I needed to deal with mental illness, I would convert to Catholicism as a gesture of placation to her. I like to collect rosaries myself. I don't always have the patience to pray them. I do keep one next to my bed though, and whenever I have a nightmare, I wake up and I hold it for a while. But no, I wear a miraculous medal, and I have a devotion to Our Lady. So the Virgin Mary, why is she so big? For those of you who aren't aware, the Virgin Mary is probably the most important person who's only a human. Jesus is of course fully human, but he's also God. So she is in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and to a certain extent in Anglicanism, depending on who you ask, she is the most important person who is only human. Now, why is this? Because she's God's mummy, to put it in very simple terms. She bore God. Now, people say, well, but God is eternal. Well, this is true. But she bore God's human incarnation. So what is kind of the ramifications of this? The Blessed Fulton Sheen, who's a man I highly recommend pretty much anything he did. He's an inspiration for me and part of why I started doing this. He wrote a book called The World's First Love. If you Google, I'll try to remember to put a link to it. If you search on YouTube, he did an excellent lecture called The Virgin Mary, the Woman I Love. And he wrote a book about her called The Virgin Mary, the World's First Love. He was a archbishop of New York, or I forget if he was from New York. It's kind of confusing. But he was an archbishop. He was the world's first televangelist. Not like modern televangelists. He had a show called Life is Worth Living, very optimistic title, and he would lecture about things. And he was just an extremely charismatic guy who could take complex theological concepts. So he kind of said in very kind of almost folksy, I mean that in a good way, terms. He said, the Virgin Mary, so let me just go through a bit of what he said about it. He said men tend to be idealists. Men tend to love an idea before they love reality. He said very often, men will have an ideal version of what they want in a woman. It may even come down to physical features, and eventually they'll find a woman who fulfills that ideal. And that's just kind of the way men are in general. They will imagine an ideal, and then they will fulfill it. Because it is the masculine nature to create and destroy. Which in that lecture he explained that's why only men can be priests, in part because men create and destroy, women nurture and maintain. It's kind of this fundamental theological distinction of rules. So Jesus, for his part in God, back at the beginning of the universe, when he created it and he had his grand plan to come into the world to liberate us from sin, his mother was an idea in his mind. And he talked about the idea, and there is a artist named Whistler who painted a famous painting of his mother, and someone asked him, how could you paint such a beautiful picture of your mother? And he said, well, it's just natural that whenever a man is talking about his mommy, he tries to make her as beautiful as he can and as perfect as he can. Um, Boys and girls, particularly young men, have a special relationship with their mother. Their mother is normally the one who loves them unconditionally because she's the one who bore them in their womb. They grew within her. Men unconditionally love their mother in a way that they don't their father. There's always a certain distance with their father. Their father's there to kind of help them grow and to be kind of a respectful but somewhat distant figure. But generally speaking, if guys get into fight with their fathers, they go and their mother is always the one who comforts them, who takes them into their lap, who is just there to love them and to nurture them. And why would God be any different when he was a human? So Jesus had the love that any man has for his mother. There is, though, the case that in this case, unlike any other case, he created his mother. He built her. She was an idea in his mind. It's the only case in history of the son creating the mother. So he had her planned. He loved her as an idea for all time before she was brought into existence into the flesh. So she is, in a sense, the perfect woman. Now, theologically, in the Old Testament, the fall of man is caused by the woman, aka Eve, eating of the fruit. The serpent seduces her and gets her to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good or evil, and that act of disobedience brings original sin in the world. And when that happens, God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman will crush you underfoot. So we have this foreshadowing that eventually a woman will come, or just women in general, will smash Satan. It's kind of Jesus and Mary are supposed to be a mirror of Adam and Eve. They're the perfected version. They are without sin. Just as Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, so Mary and Jesus remove sin from the world. So the Virgin Mary, by bearing the Messiah who will eventually crush Satan, is reversing what Eve did. Eve followed the advice of Satan in the form of a serpent, and the Virgin Mary brought Jesus into the world, who crushes Satan. So it's just, part of it is Mary is just a very big humanizing thing, because Jesus is kind of remote. He's hard to relate to. I know he's fully human, but he's also God. He was a man. He did get hungry. He did get tired. He did get angry. He did have human frailties, but he also created the universe. But in Mary, we have this rather fully human. I'm not going to say she's ordinary, but she was kind of this normal woman who was tasked with bearing God. And it was a task that she was uniquely created for. And the theology of that depends a bit on who you're talking to. The Orthodox reject original sin. Both Orthodox and Catholics believe that Mary was sinless, much in the way Jesus was sinless. In Catholicism, one of two infallible declarations. People always make a lot out of papal infallibility, but the two declarations I think that were made were the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is the idea that the Virgin Mary was born without original sin, and that was partially what enabled her to birth Jesus. And there's kind of this thing in Christianity. There's a reoccurrent theme that you have to take something into yourself to change it. The priest has to drink some of the wine, and he takes that into himself, and he converts the rest of the wine to the blood of Christ. So Virgin Mary took God into her and converted him into a human to bridge the two, to kind of act as the priest drinking the wine, in this case, birthing a human that would convert all of humanity to the divine. There's an old expression, God became man, so man would become God, and he became man through the Virgin Mary. So in order to do that, part of that was her to be sinless. So she was conceived without sin. Now the Orthodox reject the concept of original sin, It's largely kind of more of a cultural and linguistic difference than an actual theological one, but they maintain that the Theotokos, or God bearer as they call her, was was not was conceived without sin because all humans were, but she, through her own strength of will, kept from sinning her entire life. And so we have this image of the ideal woman, not the ideal woman by some man, but God's version of the ideal woman. Perfectly beautiful, perfectly feminine, perfectly loving. And because she's a mother to God, she is in essence a mother to us all. She's a figure more approachable by Jesus. Because just as Jesus is the link between the Father and us, the Virgin Mary is the link between Christ and us. She's kind of, much as God is our Father, she is our mother. And you go to your mother when you're afraid of your father. Because your mother doesn't judge you, she just loves you. And that's kind of Virgin Mary's role. She just loves Catholics, she just loves humanity. You just go to her, and she takes you in her arms, and lets you rest your head on her lap, and just loves you and forgives you unconditionally. Michelangelo made that famous statue, I think it was Michelangelo or Donatello, where the Virgin Mary's holding Christ in her arms, the crucified Christ in her arms, like he was a baby. So in the Nativity, I think G.K. Chesterton probably best described the beauty of the situation. When Jesus was born, I think, no, sorry, it was Fulton Sheen who said, in all points in history, women will tell their children, look up, there's the stars. The Virgin Mary was the one case where she could look down and see the stars in her arms. And G.K. Chesterton talked about what was so miraculous about Christ was when he was born and lying in the manger, the arms that had carved the stars in the heavens, that had carved the earth, that had carved the universe, could not reach the cows above him. And you have this beautiful image of the all-powerful being reduced to the powerless, and to bridge a gap between them, to bridge a gap between the divine and us. And that was enabled through the Virgin Mary. And she made that decision through her own free will. She was a teenage, unmarried woman in a society that didn't tolerate, that was extremely judgmental, that viewed any kind of infidelity or premarital sex or particularly getting pregnant as a grave sin, something probably punishable by stoning. And an angel appeared to her, and she was kind of terrified, and the angel said, I am going to ask you to bear the Messiah. It will be painful. It will be extremely difficult on you. You will face social shame. You will have to watch your son die. Your perfect son, who you will love more than life itself. Will you do it though for the forgiveness of humanity? And she said, yes. I submit myself to you, God. I am your perfect servant, more or less. And she said yes. All of human history could have been condemned to sin and death, and the Messiah might never have come, but she said yes. Did God know she would say yes? Was she created to say yes? She certainly was. But that doesn't change the fact that she made that decision of her own free will, and that we all have to be eternally grateful to her for that. Now, the thought is in Catholicism, tradition holds that Joseph was an old widower, that James, his brothers were actually Joseph's children, and they were his half brothers. That what basically happened was Mary kind of needed a cover, otherwise they'd stone her for having a baby who didn't have an obvious father. So Joseph was a widower who was not interested in her sexually because he was an old man, and this is kind of reinforced by the fact he doesn't show up later on, implying he kind of died from old age, and he was basically kind of chosen as a protector of her. And we see this in the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is not canon, but it's given some weight. It's considered an important kind of traditional thing. So she said yes. She said yes. And we kind of, if you look at the Rosary, we have all these events. Mary does not feature that prominently in the Gospels, but she's always present during the most important places in Jesus' life. She's there when he begins his ministry at the wedding of Cana. She's the one who gets him to start his ministry. She is, and it's just, you have to keep thinking about this. She nursed God at her breast. She bathed God when he was a little child. She fed him. She clothed him. She loved him. She nurtured him. She nurtured the one who created the universe. She raised him to be the Messiah. And she stood there and watched as her son, her perfect son, God incarnate, was brutally murdered. And she took that, and that's why she's the mother of sorrows. So then we have what happens is John takes her. Jesus on the cross, his last thoughts are, he imparts his mother's care to John, because John is his favorite disciple. And he says, take care of my mother. And John lived with Mary. Now keep this in mind. John had God's mother, and he'd talk, living with him, and he would talk to her over breakfast and stuff like that. And she would impart all her reflections on Jesus to him. I believe the Bible says Mary considered these things deep in her heart. So she's kind of considered the founder of contemplative prayer. And John was able to pick her brain for decades. And the Gospel of John is often kind of considered the Gospel of Mary. It has that really high Christology, that focus on Jesus as God, as being perfect. Because it's written by John with a lot of influence from his mother, from Jesus' mother. And tradition holds that because she was without sin, she did not have to suffer death. That is one of two infallible statements made by the Pope. I think there's a couple others, but they're not as important. That the Virgin Mary did not die, she ascended to heaven. Christ came down and took her up to heaven. Whether that's bodily or her soul was just taken directly to heaven, I'm not really sure. There's a variety of opinions on it, I believe. And then we get to the title of the Queen of Heaven. Why is she the Queen of Heaven? Well, because Jesus is the king. Jesus is the king of Israel. And there's an old tradition in Israel, because many of the kings of Israel practiced polygamy, which God never endorsed. They just kind of did it anyways, because that's what Semites do. And I don't mean that to be dismissive. I mean, Arabs practiced it. A lot of Jews practiced it. It was never looked upon favorably, but people just kind of did stuff because it was back during a very poor, primitive era. But there's a tradition in parts of polygamy that the Queen of Israel was not the wife of the king. The Queen of Israel was the mother of the king, and she would sit by his side, and she would be the Queen of Israel. She would be kind of the dowager queen, if you will, and she would have immense influence. Her son would listen to her. She'd be present at public ceremonies, etc. So Jesus is the king of the universe, and he's also, in his human form at least, an Israelite. So it makes sense. His mother is the Queen of Heaven. She sits beside him, and we see this in the Bible, where we have the woman crowned with the 7 stars. We have it, the image is prominent throughout the Bible, that she is the Queen of Heaven, she is the Queen of Angels. She sits at the, I guess the left hand of God the Father, but she sits beside her Son in heaven. And Christ is bound by the laws of God, because he is God, and he's bound by his own laws. And the 10 Commandments say to honor and love thy mother and father. And Christ loves his mommy. And I say mommy rather than mother because it is personal. As I said, she nursed him at her breast. She is close to God in a way none of the rest of us can ever imagine. And she shows up throughout history. She is kind of the patron of the church, because the church is always kind of the feminine aspect. You have priests and Jesus, who are the masculine aspect, and the church is the feminine aspect. God is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the creator and the destroyer. He made the universe, and he will come at the end of the universe to destroy it and recreate it. Mary is kind of the sustainer of the universe. She is the sustainer of the church. It is her love that binds us all together. Part of why we pray to her for intercession is that she's God's mommy, and boys listen to their mummies, especially Jesus. He's a mommy's boy. So you go and you ask the lady who is just so compassionate and loves all her children, including all of humanity, unconditionally. And you say, look, can you go and talk to your son because he listens to his mummy, and that's just kind of how it is. I remember just to conclude a story. I forget his name. He was a king of Castile, and he would walk around with a rosary on his belt, and he would encourage people to pray the rosary. Now he didn't pray it himself, but he publicly promoted the veneration of the Virgin Mary and carried it. And he had a near death experience, and he was before God, and God had said, "Look, you did all these immoral things in your life. You're going to go to hell." And then in his vision, the Virgin Mary showed up, and she said, "No, but wait." And then, kind of on the scales of justice, she put all the rosaries and all the prayers that had been inspired by the king's gesture of wearing the rosary, and that balanced the scales in his favor. And she said, "Look at all the good this man has done. Look at how much he loved me. Please give him another chance." And God acquiesced. So she was kind of the merciful figure to God's justice. And the man came back, and I believe he's a saint actually, because he became very devout and prayed the rosary daily, every day for the rest of his life. And that's kind of the Virgin Mary. For people who have trouble with their mothers, people who have trouble with their parents, for people who really are filled with self-hatred and doubt and see themselves as unworthy of God's love, she's the mother figure you can always go running to. You can always grasp her skirts because she is the eternal mother. Even when your mother dies or you're estranged from her, your relationship isn't the best with her, you have this perfect mother figure who will always love you unconditionally, love you in a completely human way, and who is God's mommy, who is the Queen of Heaven and sits beside him, and to whom all creation bows to, the second greatest thing in existence. And that's why we love the Virgin Mary, because she is the feminine aspect of it. She's often called the co-redemptrix, because it is through her that God came into the world. Obviously, God created her, and we're not saying she's part of the Trinity or something like that. But she is the ultimate woman, just as Christ is the ultimate man. And they are the new Adam and the new Eve. And they are the king and queen, respectively, of all creation. So I hope that explains a bit of it. I hope you enjoyed that. I put this off for a while just because it's a difficult, extensive topic to cover. This is Argent Templar signing out.